In this video, I want to analyze the first fugue from Bach's Well-Tempered Clavier. This fugue does not have a consistently recurring countersubject, so it would be classified as a simple fugue, just like the others that I showed in the previous video. Without a countersubject, simple fugues usually need to rely on some other unique feature in order to maintain the listener's interest. You will recall that in the simple fugues composed by Fuchs, his subject could form two different strettos, and that allowed the composer to maintain interest by spreading the strettos out throughout the form of the fugue. The remarkable thing about Bach's C major fugue is the sheer number of strettos that the subject affords. The fugue is only 27 measures long, but Bach manages to stuff 29 statements of the subject and answer into it, and he reveals not 2, but 8 different strettos for this subject. In fact, more than 8 if we're counting inversions. First, I'm going to talk through all 8 of the strettos so that we can appreciate the material that Bach was working with. Admittedly, this first part of the video will be a little bit tedious, so I won't blame you if you feel the need to skip ahead. Then, in the second part of the video, we will look at the finished piece itself to see how Bach chose to distribute those materials into a finished work of art. I'm going to label the strettos in order of the time delay between the leading and following voice. Here is the tightest stretto, with the fugue subject leading and the answer following a fourth below at a time delay of only 1 quarter note. I'm calling this one Stretto 1A, and to make it easier to remember, I'm coloring it blue. There are 2 dissonant intervals in need of explanation. In the second measure, the 7th on beat 2 and the 2nd on beat 3 are both dissonant suspensions created by tying over one of the voices from the previous beat. They have unusual resolutions in that the dissonant note is decorated with an upper neighbor before descending to the resolution. That is what the diagonal line indicates. The suspended note G only resolves to F after the bass note has changed, which is something that I've talked about in the video on how to compose suspension chords. This stretto works in invertible counterpoint at the octave, where the subject leads in the lower voice and the answer following a fifth above, which we'll call Stretto 1B. Here is Stretto 2A, which will be colored teal. Here, the following voice has a time delay of half a measure and follows a fifth below the leading voice. Notice that on the last eighth note of the first measure, we get direct motion to an octave. This would be an imperfection in two-voice writing, so when Bach uses this stretto in his fugue, he will want to use the other voices in the texture to somehow distract from that voice-leading weakness. Here is Stretto 2B. Bach ends up not using this possibility in the fugue, and we can understand why. The direct motion to an octave in Stretto 2A is much worse when inverted into direct motion to a perfect unison. And when composing for a keyboard instrument, we want to avoid these kinds of unisons in general, since they become inaudible on an instrument with a single manual. Here is Stretto 3A. Here, the following voice follows at the same time delay of half a measure, but now at the ninth below. It also involves some chromaticism that would not have been there in an exact transposition of the fugue subject. This stretto also features direct motion to an octave, but you can't make an omelet without cracking some eggs, and as we will see, Bach had a very high tolerance for this particular kind of voice leading error, especially if you can find a way to bury it amongst the other voices. Here is the inversion Stretto 3B. Here we see that the fifths of the original become elevenths, or fourths, in the inverted form. Fourths are only considered a harmonic dissonance if they occur with respect to the bass voice. So, as long as Bach introduces this stretto in two upper parts, there will be no problem with unprepared dissonances. Here is Stretto 4A. We're halfway there. If you didn't notice, this one's a bit crunchier than the others. Bach does not use this possibility in the fugue, but instead he uses the inversion, Stretto 4B. Here, the following voice follows at the upper octave. This one isn't perfectly strict counterpoint either, as there is direct motion to a fifth, and Bach will end up having to treat these sevenths as slightly awkward chordal sevenths that don't resolve down by step. Here is Stretto 5A. This one is perfectly workable. Notice that Bach's use of the C sharp in the following voice prevents direct motion to a fifth, since now the fifth is diminished instead of perfect. And here is Stretto 5B. This one works perfectly well in strict two-voice counterpoint. The unison is awkward on a keyboard instrument, so this one will work best if there's an additional octave separating the voices. Here is Stretto 6A, where the following voice enters three quarter notes after the leader at the interval of a lower octave. Yikes! 3 consecutive parallel octaves. Bach's solution to this is going to be to simply use an incomplete statement of the subject in the leading voice, diverting the upper voice into florid counterpoint before the octaves happen. Incomplete statements of the subject are more common near the end of a fugue, so we can expect to see this stretto later on in the piece. And here is Stretto 6B. This one works just as well as 6A and will also require an incomplete statement of the subject in the leading voice. Here is Stretto 7A in fuchsia. This stretto begins on an unprepared 11th, and so it will also need to occur between upper voices above a bass. It also features direct motion to an octave, but we're sort of all in on those by this point. Stretto 7B works just as well as 7A, but Bach happens not to use it in the fugue. Finally, here is Stretto 8A, where the leader follows at a time delay of a full measure at the interval of the lower fourth. Along with Stretto 1A, this stretto forms the most perfect strict two-voice counterpoint. The inversion, though, Stretto 8B, has some potential parallel unisons, and so it is not used by Bach in the fugue. The exposition for this fugue is slightly irregular. Most fugue expositions alternate subject and then answer, but Bach gives the subject to the alto, answer to the soprano, and then reverses things by giving the answer twice in a row to the tenor, and then the subject to the bass. Just as in the last video, the notes written in red are free, florid counterpoint. Let's listen. Before moving on, I want to discuss Bach's florid counterpoint. To a large extent, Bach composed the free accompanimental lines based on motives derived from the fugue subject. This ascending, stepwise filling in of a fourth, for instance, recurs over and over, mainly sped up into 16th notes, and sometimes inverted to descend rather than ascend. These jaunty eighth note leaps, alternating upward and downward, are also repeated within the florid counterpoint. So, even though the fugue does not use a consistent countersubject, Bach nevertheless finds as many opportunities as he can to include motivic connections in order to unify the texture. Bach then launches directly into a counter-exposition that reveals Stretto 1A between the soprano and tenor in measure 7. Many composers would have saved the tightest stretto for the end of the piece, but Bach knows he has a lot more where that came from. The alto then enters in measure 9 with the statement of the answer, and the bass enters with the answer as well in measure 10. This bass entry is accompanied by an extra alto statement using Stretto 1B, the inversion of the stretto we just heard. I'm putting this extra stretto in parentheses, since the alto voice already had a statement within this entry group, and because this is the first entry not to begin on scale degree 1 or 5. That is often the signal that we are leaving the exposition or counter-exposition and entering into the middle section of a fugue. The tenor gets one more extra statement of the subject beginning on E that is used to prepare the first strong cadence of the piece, a perfect authentic cadence in the key of A minor. Then come the middle entries. The cadence in A minor could have been used to prepare the ears for a series of entries in the key of A minor, but instead, Bach snaps back directly to the key of C major in measure 14, with alto and tenor entries using Stretto 1A again. This time, however, the bass joins in before either of them has finished, using Stretto 6A with respect to the tenor voice and Stretto 8A with respect to the alto. Recall that Stretto 6A is the one that has 3 consecutive parallel octaves in it. So notice that Bach allows the tenor voice to transition into florid counterpoint halfway through measure 15, resulting in an incomplete statement of the subject. The soprano then enters after the first 2 voices have finished their statements, but it forms a Stretto 4B with respect to the bass. Things are really starting to get colorful. As if this complete Stretto entry group wasn't impressive enough, Bach then launches into a completely different Stretto entry group. This one begins with the soprano and alto in Stretto 1A, then in measure 17, the tenor enters on the note A, forming Stretto 3A with respect to the alto, and 5A with respect to the soprano. Between the alto and tenor voices, we can see direct motion to octave Bs, approaching the downbeat of measure 18. This would be an error in a harmony textbook or a counterpoint exercise, as would the cross relation between B natural and B flat in the alto and soprano voices. But again, we tolerate them for the sake of the mind-blowing strettos. The bass then enters on D, forming Stretto 2A with respect to the tenor and Stretto 8A with respect to the alto. Between the tenor and bass, we also see direct motion to octave Fs, but the octave is placed on a weak beat, which serves to mask it somewhat. Bach then articulates the end of this section with a perfect authentic cadence in the key of D minor on beat 3 of measure 19. Let's listen. Finally, there's the closing section and coda. I've backed up to show the cadence in measure 19 once more. The soprano and bass voices both cadence very firmly, with a tenor clausula and a bass clausula, respectively. But the tenor and alto voices do something very interesting. Bach drapes the first two statements of the next section over this cadence, using Stretto 1B this time, to beautifully erode the boundary between these two large sections of music. The soprano and tenor then also enter using Stretto 7A, which has not been seen yet. Bach places this stretto above a pedal note G in the bass in order to support the perfect 11ths that I mentioned earlier. Again, we have direct motion to a perfect octave, but again, it happens on the last eighth note of the measure, and the scurrying 16th note alto voice does a good job of distracting the ears. Then, on the downbeat of measure 24, we get the final strong, perfect authentic cadence in the tonic key of C major. Typically, an entry group would be expected to include a statement in every voice, but here Bach gives 2 statements to the tenor and none to the bass. This is probably because Bach preferred to use the bass for a pedal effect. After the cadence, we get a few more entries over a tonic pedal in the bass. The tenor begins with an entry on C, the alto enters using Stretto 2B beginning on F, and the soprano gets an incomplete statement beginning on C, forming Stretto 1B with respect to the alto and Stretto 5B with respect to the tenor. So let's quickly recap a few things. First, there is more than one way to compose a fugue, and one strategy is to compose a fugue subject that affords the possibility of multiple strettos. But even with that unique fugue subject, Bach's chosen realization of the fugue was quite peculiar. One interesting exercise would be to compose a fugue of your own using Bach's subject, and to try to make it as different from his as possible. In the exposition, for instance, why did he arrange the entries subject answer answer subject? Couldn't it have worked a different way? The point of this experimentation is not to put ourselves in competition with Bach, that would be pointless, but instead to try to inhabit the same decision space that he did when he composed this fugue in order to try to understand it as comprehensively as possible. In the next video, we will begin looking at fugues designed around invertible countersubjects, starting with a countersubject invertible at the octave.